It's a big triple S.
Very good.
Well, my one and only visit to Australia, I was there on November the 11th, 1975.
That was quite a day in our history.
Indeed it was, yes.
It's still argued over ferociously. In fact, the passion doesn't seem to be diminishing with the passage of the years.
No, it was great as a young man interested in politics. It was a great time to be there.
I can still remember it.
I was learning the letter D in primary school that day, I think. I haven't advanced.
Did anyone in Aberdeen realise how significant the day was, other than as a standard Remembrance Day?
No. Well, 1975. I don't even know what happened on the 11th of November 75, Martin.
The Governor General,
the dismissal.
Gough
Oh, that one.
the then Prime Minister.
Yeah.
Oh, that day. I've heard about that day. I didn't realise it was then. Oh, controversial. Controversial. Oh, well, before we get any more discord raised, maybe we should crack on. Are we all good? Are we good there, Emily, and back? So I'll give a countdown of 5, 4, 3, and then we're good to go live, eh? Okay. 5, 4, 3. Order, and welcome to the International Trade Committee at the House of Commons. Today we have got a public evidence session with the Honourable Tony Abbott, AC, who has been appointed to the Board of Trade in the UK here. Mr. Abbott, I will let you introduce yourself more in your own terms rather than me name, rank and serial number and whatever else you like to add.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's a pleasure to be with you all, even if it's only via Zoom. It's an honour to be an advisor to the British Board of Trade. I'm confident that if my work can help to facilitate good trade deals between Britain and like-minded countries in the months to come, that will be good for Britain and good for Australia. So look, thanks for having me, and let's get on with the show.
Excellent. Fine words. Just as a kick-off, how do you see the role of the Board of Trade yourself and its relationship to the Department of International Trade?
Well, Mr. Chairman, obviously the Board of Trade itself comprises the Minister as the President and a number of other ministers, the Secretary of State for Scotland, for Northern Ireland and for Wales as Vice Presidents. Essentially, the ministers comprise the Board of Trade, and they act for and on behalf of the British government. The Board of Trade advisors act effectively as, I suppose, an advisory group for the ministers and for the ministry. Specifically, we can act as advocates for freer trade, in particular freer trade with Britain, and where possible, we can act as facilitators. Certainly, I would like to be, to the best extent possible, a facilitator towards a swift deal between the United Kingdom and Australia, because I think that no two countries are more complementary, and no two countries should be able to do a deal so easily.
Okay, do you see your role only as a sort of an interlocutor, as a sort of a catalyst perhaps between the UK and Australia, or do you see your role as being wider than that?
Well, I think I've got a wider role as an advocate for freer trade. Freer trade sometimes doesn't get the good press that it deserves, because let's face it, no trade takes place unless you've got a willing buyer and a willing seller. And at least in principle, the less obstacles there are to willing buyers and willing sellers, the better. Certainly between like-minded countries with comparable standards of living, as few barriers as possible is the best way forward. And that's one of the reasons why I think the government is so right to have as its priorities free trade deals with Australia, New Zealand, Canada and the United States, because we are obviously hugely like-minded, being Five Eyes alliance partners or Five Eyes partners, and we've all got pretty comparable standards of living. So yes, there's a role as an advocate for advisors to the Board of Trade, and in some cases there may well be a role to facilitate. I mean, I have certain networks and contacts in all sorts of places, and if I can deploy them in ways to help Britain in ways which are not inconsistent with Australia's best national interests, I'd obviously be only too happy to do so.
I mean, you've said there are as few barriers as possible, but you do accept that there are some rules that are essential in the sphere of international trade. So you will always have tram lines, at least, for trade to be able to conduct itself.
Well, Mr. Chairman, you probably should unpack that a little, but
yeah,
I mean, obviously, if something is illegal to be sold in Britain, a free trade deal with Australia doesn't mean that an Australian product that would otherwise be illegal can somehow be sold. I mean, you know, plainly, in the end, all sovereign countries are governed by their own national laws, and something that's illegal is never going to be made legal by an FTA. But nevertheless, within the law, the fewer additional barriers, such as tariff barriers, quota barriers,
Indeed, I think that's the point I was driving at when sometimes it said it's about free trade and there's few barriers. I mean, we do have essential laws, environmental laws, child labour laws, and everything else that kind of often be overlooked.
And if an Australian-made product is in breach of British environmental laws, obviously it couldn't be sold in Britain. If an Australian-produced farm product is in breach of British food standards, obviously it couldn't be sold in Britain, regardless of any tariff reductions or quota abolitions.
Yeah, thank you. The Department of International Trade has said that the board will produce a series of reports on key trade issues. What do you think your role will be in producing these reports?
Well, there are a number of reports in the pipeline. My understanding, Mr. Chairman, is that the early cabs off the rank are expected to be the Levelling Up report, how free trade can help parts of Britain that might be less economically exuberant right now. Then there's a report planned on green trade, how Britain can use trade to advance an environmental agenda. There's another report planned on trade with the Commonwealth. And I've got to say that given the goodwill that continues to exist between Britain and the countries of the Commonwealth, I think it's important to make the most of that, to utilise it as far as is possible, particularly if there's not always that much goodwill just at the moment between Britain and the EU. So look, they're three reports which are coming fairly soon. My understanding is that the reports will be drafted in the ministry. Advisors to the Board of Trade will be invited to have their input, but in the end, the reports will be prepared by the ministry. My understanding is that it is yet to be decided whether these reports will be reports to government or reports by government, but certainly the understanding at the moment is that the essential drafting will be done by the civil service in the Ministry of International Trade.
Thank you. I wonder if the reports to and by government, but time will tell.
Well, that's a very good question, and a report by government obviously has a different status and operates under different sorts of expectations and understandings than a report to government. I mean, a report to government can canvass a whole lot of issues in a way that a report by government normally can't. And as I said, I think it's yet to be determined exactly what the President of the Board of Trade wants these reports to do. But certainly the subject areas have been well and truly delineated. And my understanding is that those three topics that I mentioned are likely to be the first ones produced.
Thank you very much. My final point, and it probably might have been covered, but I'll ask it in a catch-all manner. Following, the board's recent meetings, what do you think the objectives are and the plans are for the next few months over and above the reports?
Well, look, plainly, the most important priority for Britain in the next few weeks is doing the best it can to secure the best possible deal with the EU. That's not our job, obviously. That's the job of the ministers and officials dealing specifically with Brexit. I would have thought that our job is to try to get the best possible deals as quickly as we can with Australia, Canada and the United States. And I know that on both sides, there is an eagerness to try to get the Australian deal done before Christmas. And I hope that in the next negotiating session, both sides are prepared to put all their cards on the table so that the best possible deal can be hammered out. I mean, ideally, a deal between Britain and Australia would involve no tariffs, no quotas, as full as possible mutual recognition of standards and qualifications, and as free as possible movement of people for well-paid work, not welfare. That's got to be the objective in any negotiation between two like-minded countries of comparable standard of living. And plainly, given the history between Britain and Australia and the complementarity of our economies, a deal of such ready economic integration should be more possible with us than with almost anyone else, except perhaps Britain and the countries of the EU, given that they have been so integrated for so long. But that, I suspect, will take a little more goodwill on the part of EU negotiators. That's always been obvious.
Indeed, thank you. Some of us, of course, would argue that the UK has had the best possible deal with the EU and is walking away from it at the moment, but we better not go down that rabbit hole at all.
But Chairman, the problem, if I may say so, and pardon me for interrupting and
feel free.
Getting into fraud territory, but
even
the
better.
Problem with the problem with the EU is that it wasn't just an economic area. It was a political project as well as an economic project. And I think one of the fundamental divergence of Britain with the rest of the EU was because at least the French and the Germans and the Italians saw it as a political project. The British saw it as an economic project, but as time went by, it became more and more obvious that there was an overriding political dimension to the whole thing, which the people of Britain, by a decisive but narrow majority, chose to reject back in 2016.
Indeed, those are the perceptions, and these are the perceptions that are going to cost from 5 to 7% of GDP. But we are now going down the rabbit hole. Anthony Mangle.
We are. And look, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for the good-humoured way in which you're approaching this. But look, we can't undo what's been done. At least in the short or medium term. The challenge now is to make the best possible go. It's to have a red hot go in the big, wide, wonderful world that Britain is now going into as a fully sovereign, independent country. I mean, Australia is one of the proudest products of global Britain. And now that we've got global Britain about to join us again, I think it's in everyone's interest that we make the best of it.
We'll see what a bit of poverty does. Anthony Mangle.
I might say, Mr. Chair, that some of us would also argue that there lies great opportunity ahead in us being outside of the European Union. And I'm particularly grateful that we have Mr. Abbott with us. And good evening to you.
We look forward to cleaning chimneys.
But actually, I'm going to steer us all away from this subject because it's going to detract us from the important insight that we're going to get. And if I can, Mr. Abbott, can we just go back to how you were selected for the board of trade and what that process was?
Well, thank you. Look, I'm not sure how formal the process was, but I received a phone call one evening from the Secretary of State, Liz Truss. She said, we're going to reconstitute the Board of Trade, including a number of advisors. And would you be prepared to be one of the advisors? And I said, look, I'd love to be considered. I'd be happy to help as far as I'm able, given that I think Britain's success is not only in the interests of Britain, but in the interests of Australia, in the interests of the wider world. Now, obviously, I was an Australian Prime Minister who had a record of getting deals done. We had deals under negotiation with China, Japan, and South Korea for almost a decade when I became PM at the end of 2013. They'd been languishing largely because, particularly under the former government, the negotiators had been, dare I say it, a little too preoccupied with labour standards, with environmental standards. All these are important. I don't for a second minimise them, but in the end, a trade deal is about trade. So I said, look, focus on the essence of it, get the best deal that you can within 12 months. So I gave them a goal, I gave them a target, a timeline, and at the same time I stressed to the national leaders of those countries just how important these deals were in terms of deepening partnership between Australia and China, Japan, and South Korea, respectively. So look, I had a pretty good record. I didn't want the best to be the enemy of the good, as it so often is. The Japan deal gave us much better access to the Japanese market. The China deal was the first deal that China did with another G20 economy. And likewise, the Korea deal was a very good deal for us, and I think for Korea too. So look, while you could always say that any of these deals could have been better, they basically in every case covered something like 98% of our two-way trade, made all of that over time free of tariffs and quotas, with most favoured nation provisions, so that any future deals that any of us did with better terms would be replicated in the deals we had. So look, there was a good record there, and that's why Scott Morrison, our Prime Minister, made the observation that it was a good hire, although he perhaps could have said that it was an honorary hire as opposed to a hire for a fee.
If I could, Chair, could I just follow up?
Yes, of course.
Is you've just listed some incredibly successful trade deals that you undertook during your premiership. Can I just push you on the sort of lessons that you learned from those trade deals and how that might replicate itself in the future trade deals that the UK is going to do with other countries?
Yeah, well, look, thanks very much. Look, we essentially had two substantial deals prior to my time as PM. There was the closer economic relations partnership with New Zealand, which had been on foot for about 2 decades. And there was the deal with the United States that we did under the Howard government in, I think, 2005. That covered about under 20% of our trade. Over 70% of our trade was covered pretty much 12 months into my time as PM. So these were, it was a purple patch for Australian trade diplomacy, you might say. Look, the lesson was, don't sweat the small stuff. Get the best deal you can if necessary, by looking at the other deals that these countries have done and taking the best aspects of each of them, stapling it together and doing it with us, and then put in place a process to try to ensure that anything that can't be satisfactorily resolved here and now, at least there's an ongoing process for improvement in the months and years ahead. I mean, none of these deals are static. And as you might know, there's a bit of tension, a bit of trade tension at the moment between Australia and China, notwithstanding the deal. But hopefully all of these deals take your trade partnership, your economic partnership to a higher level. And there's a ratchet operation, so it can only further improve rather than deteriorate.
Thank you. In the danger of us being static and with the tension with time, I'll move on to Mark Menzies. Mark. Sorry.
That's great. Thank you, Chairman. Mr. Abbott, I think it's fair to say when you were Prime Minister of Australia, you focused on all of the other states. It wasn't just about New South Wales. You know, Western Australia, Queensland, they all prospered under your premiership. So with that in mind, you know, on the UK government web pages about the Board of Trade, it says the Board of Trade is, and I quote, focused on promoting the UK regions and nations as destinations to trade and do business with, and then close quotes. So can you explain what steps the Board of Trade is taking to make sure that the whole of the UK benefits from international trade?
Well, thanks, Mark. Look, plainly, the Vice Presidents of the Board of Trade are the Secretaries of State for the other constituent parts of the United Kingdom, Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland. And you'd think almost by the nature of the Board of Trade, a Scotch, an Irish and a Welsh perspective will come into their thinking. One of the things that I did was to try to include the premiers in our trade, our general trade discussions, not in terms of the specific negotiations, but in terms of the general discussions. For instance, in April of 2014, I took a very big delegation to China. That was the time when we actually finalised the trade deal between Australia and China. And the delegation that I took included 5 of the 6 state premiers. We had a joint meeting between myself as Prime Minister and President Xi in the Great Hall with 5 state premiers along as well. And I think that was a pretty good indication to the Chinese that this was a wholehearted national effort on our part. And I think it was also a bit of a lesson to our own negotiators to try to be as inclusive as possible when you're thinking about the different interests of the different regions of our country.
That's great. Thanks very much. Thank you.
We look forward to seeing Mark Drakeford, Nicola Sturgeon, Boris Johnson, and persons from Northern Ireland in the Great Hall of the People at some point. Mark Garnier, I don't know if you've been in the Great Hall of the People, but I'm sure we'll hear.
I have been, and I hope I'll go back again. Mr. Abbott, look, thanks very much for coming and joining us. I'm quite interested in your views on how the Board of Trade can help promote Britain's role on the global world trade sort of arena. The Secretary of State, Liz Truss, said on the 29th of October, she made a speech in Chatham House that she wants to re-establish the UK, she wanted the Board of Trade to re-establish the UK as a major voice in global trade. Now, it's a great ambition to have, but how can the Board of Trade play its part in that?
Well, I think she wants us to be advocates rather than negotiators. And obviously, if you've got people of some standing and credibility when it comes to successful trade negotiations as members of the Board of Trade, that gives you a certain amount of clout. I mean, for instance, were I to be in Washington, for instance. And, you know, as we know, travel at the moment is heavily interrupted by virtue of the pandemic. But were I to be in Washington at the moment, I would certainly be doing my best in every possible circumstance to impress upon the Americans the benefits of swiftly doing a good deal with the United Kingdom. I'd also be impressing upon the Americans the benefits of having another look at the Trans-Pacific Partnership. I mean, you know, without going into the rights and wrongs of the recent election, obviously a change of administration is an opportunity to have another look at things. And it's interesting that the Obama administration launched the Trans-Pacific Partnership. During the 2016 campaign, both sides of American politics pulled away from the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which I think was a pity, understandable in some respects, but a pity. Now's a chance, I hope, to have another look at the TPP. And obviously, Britain's accession to the TPP, which I hope will swiftly happen, will make the TPP an even more important trade body for the United States to be part of.
I think, I do want to ask you some more questions about that, but I'll come back to that a bit later in this evidence session, if I may, because it's a very important thing. But I think how you've described the role of the Board of Trade and your role within it as one of these sort of, you know, the very noteworthy advisors, you've described it how you would try to help Britain get better trade deals. And I think what Liz Truss was trying to say was that Britain will be a global advocate of free trade. So not necessarily secure good, obviously we want to secure good trade deals, but this is not about securing good trade deals. It's about being a big, important voice. And obviously, you know, for example, trying to get Liam Fox to be the Director General of the WTA was part of that. But it's, you know, there's an awful lot of good that comes out of free trade, as I'm sure we'll all agree. How does you, in your role of the Board of Trade, help Britain's voice become greater in the great campaign to get better free trade globally?
Well, look, obviously, I'm not speaking on this subject simply as a former Australian Prime Minister. I'm now speaking on this subject as a former Australian Prime Minister who is an active ally of the United Kingdom in this very important respect. And again, I think the important thing to remember with trade is that you can't have trade without a willing buyer and a willing seller. And just as if you've got a willing buyer and a willing seller on the high street of any town in Britain, that's a very good thing. And the fewer obstacles to willing sales, voluntary sales, the better. In principle, there's no difference between the transactions that take place on the high street and the transactions that take place between High Street and Main Street. In principle, there's no difference. And I appreciate that, you know, geopolitical considerations can play a part, and there might be all sorts of trades that we don't want to see done with countries that are our strategic rivals. But certainly between countries that are strategically at one, which are very substantially like-minded across the board, as Britain and Australia and the United States and all the Five Eyes countries are, and that have comparable standards of living. So there's no question of anyone's wage rates being significantly undermined. There's no question of anyone's environmental standards or animal welfare standards being significantly undermined. These are the deals that really should be done easily and swiftly.
Okay, just one last question, if I may.
Thank you.
Teddy, you've demonstrated that you're a friend of the UK by taking the role of the Board of Trade. But a good friend of a country can also be a critical friend of a country. And I'm interested in your views on whether you think our trade policy supports our aim of sort of truly global Britain. And if you think there's anything that we're not doing right that we ought to try to address, here's your opportunity to.
Yeah, well, look, I you know, friends should be critical behind closed doors rather than rather than in what is inevitably a public forum.
Yeah.
I don't want to be critical of Britain because I think
it's an open society, please. We aren't in China.
Any of the constituent parts of Britain, even though I did notice that the First Minister of the marvellous country of Scotland was a little critical of my role. But look,
surely not. Surely that was an interpretation.
Look, maybe it got lost. Maybe the accent. The accent was too much for me, perhaps. But look, I suppose the cautionary note that I gave to my public servants back in 2013, the cautionary note that I gave to my negotiators back then, I'd probably give generally: if you want a trade deal, focus on trade. If you want to do an environmental deal or an animal welfare deal, do it through COP or through some other mechanism. And remember that the best is the enemy of the good. If we hold out for a deal which is absolutely perfect in every respect, we may well never get it. But if we take the best we can get at this time, that's nearly always good in itself and is the best possible platform for further progress.
Can I just one very, very quick question? Your fellow Antipodean, Crawford Falconer, when I was a minister in the Department of International Trade, once said to me that the best trade deal is when both sides of the deal are equally pissed off. Is that a fair assessment?
Briefly, please.
Yeah, look, I don't think trade negotiators should approach their job as lawyers to a divorce settlement. You know, trade negotiators should approach their job as the facilitators of a happy partnership, because you do not do trade deals with countries where you don't at least think there's a fair degree of mutual self-interest. And in the case of countries like Britain and Australia, there's not just mutual self-interest, there's a vast amount of attitudinal comparability, of shared history, of mutual goodwill, and let's build on that.
Fantastic. Thanks very much. Thank you. Thank you.
I think I can hear the music. Here comes the trade deal down the island, down the aisle at the moment, or down the island be appropriate for me. Craig Williams.
Thank you, Chair. Thanks, Mr. Abbott. I suppose building on those points, both from our Chair about the trade deal, Mr. Carney, given your role and what you've been telling us today, and given what you said on record about facilitating trade deals between Britain and other countries, I wonder whether we could dig into how you're going to achieve that facilitation as an advisor, and how you integrate into the Department for International Trade to facilitate that.
Well, look, I was able to do some online conferencing with senior members of the Ministry of International Trade when I was in London a few weeks back, and hopefully helped to get the message across that you don't want to let the best be the enemy of the good. I've been able to have some private discussions with senior members of the negotiating teams of both Britain and Australia about the desirability of getting this thing done sooner rather than later. It's informal. It's behind the scenes. It's not negotiating as such. That's for the negotiating teams, not for people like me. But it hopefully is a way of reminding, in a very friendly way, the negotiating teams about the overall interest that both countries have in getting the best possible deal done as quickly as possible.
I wonder whether I could, Chair, just ask a very quick question, since as you're in front of us, and very quick. And that's, you say over and again about, you know, the best being the enemy of the good and sweating the small stuff. As an MP that cares more about sheep meat than probably any other member of Parliament, you know, how would you advise both this committee and our negotiators to keep me happy on the sheep meat, but get the cheese? Okay.
Well, look. One of the ways we managed to do the deal with Japan, and Japan has a very strong farm lobby, they have a particularly strong rice farm lobby, was to phase out tariffs over, I think, 15 years. any half-decent farmer, and I believe British farmers are as good as farmers anywhere. I mean, you only have to look at the farms of Britain to see how magnificent they are. You know, some, I suppose, are a kind of lifestyle rather than agribusinesses, but nevertheless, they're much loved by the people who work them. And whether you're producing at volume or at quality or both, I reckon there ain't no British farmer who doesn't want to do the best possible job. And so I would be confident that under any deal, there will be a great place for high quality British farm products. And in terms of assuaging any anxiety that your farm constituents might have, phase the tariffs out over a significant period so people have the chance to adjust, both in terms of their marketing, their product offering, because look, farmers are very adaptable. British farmers, no less than Australian ones. Don't forget, I know there's understandable anxiety in many circles in Britain about the next few months. We lost a very comfortable trading relationship with the United Kingdom, you know, and at the time it was supposed to be the end of the world as we knew it. But I mean, just because our agricultural products were no longer being sold on a preferential basis in Britain didn't mean there were no markets for them.
Yeah.
It just meant that
you think there's scope for quality and volume, and then I'll shut up.
Absolutely. And look, most British producers are sort of high-end producers. Many Australian producers are commodity end producers, and over time that will adjust, I'm sure. But there's nothing wrong with adjustment, as long as people have got plenty of time to get ready for it.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the problem for Craig Williamson, for the likes of sheep producers such as myself on a small scale, is the fact that it's not our tariffs as such, it's the tariffs going up with the nearest and most important market, almost overnight to 45%, is a huge concern. But George Eustace might buy all our sheep and provide us with some new cows. So this seems to be the government, something like that anyway.
Okay, but Angus, if I may say so, that's the EU. I mean, I'm sure Britain wants to do a deal that involves zero.
That's the problem.
That's, you know,
that's our problem.
I'm sure Britain is only too happy to do a Canada-style deal with the EU. The problem is the EU doesn't want to do a Canada-style deal with Britain because the EU wants to punish Britain for having the temerity to leave.
That's what happens to a flea when it's in bed with a hippopotamus, unfortunately. Anthony Mangle, you're on next.
Mr. Chair, I think we should invite Mr. Abbott to join all of our committee meetings. If you've got the time.
It's a debate. Indeed, I'm enjoying it. Thank you, Anthony.
But listen, I just want to come back. There has been some criticism in Australia for you joining this, and certainly Mark Dreyfus, Australia's Labour's legal affairs spokesman, has made some comments around your intimate knowledge of Australia's trading interests and strategies, and questioning whether or not there could be a conflict of interest. Can you answer that? And can I also ask, what happens when we push forward for a rapid deal between Australia and the UK, and there is a conflict of interest where Australia's interests might be being challenged by a UK trade deal? What do you do in those circumstances?
Well, you see, when it comes to the essentials, I think it's very hard to see any fundamental conflict. I mean, obviously, take sheep meat, for instance, just to take an issue that's been raised already. If you're a British sheep farmer, you might want a continuing high tariff on sheep meat imports from Australia. If you're an Australian sheep farmer, you'd want the tariff reduced as quickly as possible. Now, I mean, I'm happy enough to see the tariff go down slowly, as long as it's going down surely. And in the long run, British sheep farmers will adjust. And in all of these deals, what you lose on the swings, you gain on the roundabouts, because freer trade in the end is good for everyone. And certainly it's more readily good for everyone if it's between countries that are like-minded and have comparable standards of living. I mean, if a British consumer would prefer to buy Australian lamb than British lamb, why shouldn't a British consumer be able to do that? Likewise, if an Australian consumer would like to buy British lamb over Australian lamb, why shouldn't that happen? Now, we've got to have a care, obviously, for the producers, because, you know, a decent centre-right government is always concerned about the social fabric, and farmers and farm communities are an important part of the social fabric. But we can't keep the status quo preserved in aspic forever. And if consumer tastes change, we've got to accept that that's the right of consumers. And over time, I think everyone will admit, including British farmers, that the fewer barriers, the better, provided everyone is competing on a level playing field.
Thank you.
I really do want to stress, Anthony, that you know, you should not approach trade negotiations as a zero-sum game. You know, this is not a divorce. A trade negotiation is not a divorce settlement. It's effectively negotiating a partnership where both partners want to get together because both partners appreciate that on balance, they've got a lot to add to each other.
It is, and just as an observation rather than a question, that is something that has come up more than time and time again, where we've talked about agricultural welfare standards. We've also failed to recognise the opportunities that lie for our beef and sheep farmers.
That's correct. And look, if we're talking about...
I'll have to interrupt you due to time. I think Martin Vickers wants to get together and have a partnership with a witness for the moment or two coming up. Martin Vickers.
Yeah, thank you, Chairman. Mr. Abbott, you've already to some extent outlined the successes and challenges of Australia's trade agreements, and you rightly say that you had a record of getting them done. How do you think the approach that you took when Prime Minister how will you adapt that to your new role, and how will it inform your approach to your present role?
Well, look, I suppose one of the things, Martin, about the new role is that I'm sort of much more down in the nitty-gritty, as it were. As a Prime Minister, you obviously are sort of up here at this level, even as a discussant in gatherings such as this. You're much more down at nitty-gritty things like sheep farming and animal welfare standards and so on. But again, one of the beauties of a deal between Australia and Britain is that even if our environmental standards, for argument's sake, or our animal welfare standards might differ in small detail, they don't differ in substance. I mean, Australian farmers do not mistreat their animals. The Australian public does not tolerate environmental vandalism. We do not want to see our land poisoned or our water poisoned. We do not want to see animal welfare compromised. So, you know, we're not a third world country where they might feel that they've got to cut corners through economic necessity. And you know what Australians are like, Martin. We know what Britons are like. We know that you're a generous and high-minded people, and I hope that you know that we are a generous and high-minded people.
Well, some of the negotiations we'll be undertaking over the next few years will be with countries that do not have higher standards as
Correct.
our two countries.
Correct.
How would you adapt to those circumstances?
Well, I think you'd cross that bridge when you came to it. And look, if you were talking about, a country that had perhaps different standards, you deal with that, I guess, by your own domestic law, saying that in order to be sold in Britain, chicken can't be washed in chlorine, for argument's sake, or in order for barley or wheat or something to be sold in Britain, it can't have been treated with chemicals X, Y, and Z. That would be the way to do it, rather than by keeping high tariffs or quotas on those countries. Very good.
Thank you, Angus.
Great, and that good use of environmental law there indeed. I'm going now to Lloyd Russell Moyle, who will have his microphone open now. Lloyd Russell Moyle.
Thank you, Mr. Abbott. In an answer to a question earlier on, you said, of course, don't sweat the small stuff. You've repeated that a number of times. If we take that in conjunction with previous statements on workers' rights being a sidetrack to a trade deal, or that climate change is absolute crap, I think was your words. Can I just clarify what you mean by the small stuff? Bearing in mind the Prime Minister has made a real commitment on things like climate change. We're hosting the COP.
Well, Lloyd, obviously the environment is incredibly important. As I have said time and time again, we've only got one planet and we can't ravage it. And our obligation each generation is to pass on our planet in better shape to our children and grandchildren. I mean, I accept that. I might have a different approach to zero emissions by 2050 to some others, but obviously we want to get emissions down as far and as fast as we can. All of us want that. But I just think that if you try to do everything in a trade deal, you'll end up doing nothing. There are other forums to pursue climate initiatives, such as the COP. And look, I'm sure that Boris Johnson and Scott Morrison will have all sorts of discussions in and around the COP. And I'm confident that we are going to be steadily reducing our emissions. What you don't want to do, though, is avoid doing a deal with Australia over something which might be a relatively theological point. And in so doing, needlessly advantage other countries that perhaps are much less scrupulous when it comes to environmental standards.
I understand that. And of course, I'm not particularly worried so much with a deal with Australia, but you're advising about deals all over the world, including China and of course the US, which is one of the big kind of wins. Surely you can see that there is a problem if you have a no tariff free trade agreement, but then you have environmental or workers' labour rights that aren't about the standard of the product, that you effectively make Britain less competitive than the other country that you've got the free trade deal, and you have no recourse to barriers. What you do is you're actually offshoring jobs from your country via free trade deals because your standards are rightly higher. Is there not a place in trade deals to ensure that you aren't effectively offshoring jobs because you've done the right thing on labour rights and the right thing on environmental rights?
Well, look, I think there's little doubt that in environmental rules that we've put in place in Australia have over time caused some of our heavy industry to go offshore. And that's not a function of trade deals, that's a function of environmental rules that we have decided for our own reasons to adopt here in Australia.
But surely because if you don't have a corresponding protection in the tariff or the trade, that is the thing that causes things to offshore if you have a corresponding protection in the trade tariff, i.e. that links to the additional cost of the environmental protection or the workers' rights, then you don't offshore.
Well, yes, but you don't trade. I mean, look, the truth is that, you know, trade is beneficial to everyone, but it does, over time, produce change on both sides of the trade equation. And one of the reasons why countries like China, India, more obviously Japan, Korea, Taiwan, etc., have developed. So yes, there has been some adjustment costs for